Welcome, everyone, to our webinar, Employment in the Home, Taxes and Paying on the Books. We are doing this webinar tonight in partnership with Home Work Solutions, Innovative Youth Care, and the National Domestic Workers Alliance, close partners of Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network. My name is Tatiana Bejar, and I am the New York City lead organizer at Hand in Hand. And just want to let you know that we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the recording with all of you, and also we'll upload it to our Hand in Hand's YouTube channel. If I see some people have joined, if you can please use the chat box to introduce yourself, your name, preferred pronouns, if you want, what neighborhood you are joining us, what is your connection with care, whether you are an employer of a nanny, employer of a house cleaner, home care worker, whether you are planning to hire someone, or maybe you are a domestic worker yourself. So please use the chat box to introduce yourself. And for folks who are just joining, again, I'm Tatiana Bejar, New York City lead organizer at Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network. Welcome. So for tonight, again, we continue with our 2023 Education and Implementation Program, a webinar series, My Home is a Fair Workplace. We have prepared this webinars throughout this year. As you see, the list is there with webinars from March all the way to December, in which we are really talking about the different details, aspects of domestic work, information and discussions, conversations that are equally important for employers of nannies, house cleaners, home care workers, but also for domestic workers themselves. We are all part of the same sector. I invite you to sign up and be part of the series. That means that you are going to be accessing all this information. We will be sending updated resources, work agreements, and obviously also answering any questions that you have. Tonight, we're going to be covering all the information you need about what means filing taxes and paying on the books as a domestic employer. I also want to acknowledge that hiring a nanny, house cleaner, a home care worker is really an important decision. Sometimes those decisions happen while we are in moments in our lives where we are extremely busy with a lot of stress or a lot of emotions. And at Hand in Hand, we want the working relationship to be positive. Developing and maintaining clear communication is key to developing a long-lasting, mutually beneficial working relationship. And the best way to do this is through accessing information and support you need as an employer of a domestic worker. Obviously, joining these webinars and joining the sector from a different perspective as well, right? Also use the chat box to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Again, Hand in Hand is a Domestic Employers Network. We are a nonprofit organization, a national network of parents who employ nannies, people who employ house cleaners, people with disabilities, and older adults and their families who employ home attendants, so they can live with dignity and interdependence. We support domestic employers by creating materials and resources to ensure their home is a fair workplace. Our vision is to work for an economy that centers equity, dignity, and care. We believe in a care sector where domestic workers are treated with dignity and respect and honor for their vital work, supporting us as individuals, as families, and as households. In our vision, everyone can access the care and support at home they need, because we want to live in a country that caregiving is valued and respected. And in this conversation, whether you are an employer, a worker, or someone who eventually can become an employer, we know that care is an important, basic, vital part of our lives. And I now want to give the mic to one of our longtime members, Casey Wagner.
Hi, it is a pleasure to be part of this community of learning, and I want to just express why I am a Hand in Hand member. First, access to information so I can be the best and fair employer for my mother's caregivers, Maxine and Bibi, whose kindness, devoted, skillful care made an incredible difference in her life. So I'm also an aunt to a nephew. So I'm also a Hand in Hand member. So I can share with him information that I learn so he can be a fair employer to his daughter's nanny. I also am a member of Hand in Hand to be part of a creative high road community of employers who strongly support workers' rights for domestic workers, who make all work possible. And Bibi and Maxine absolutely made my work possible in the devoted care that they provided to my mother. And also to be part of a social, racial, economic justice movement, hand in hand with domestic workers, to raise industry standards in the care sector. So I invite you to join Hand in Hand as a member. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. And by becoming a member or donating, you help us continue with this work, right? Creating all these materials, facilitating conversations and information that you need as a worker, as an employer in particular, and especially creating this space in which you could listen also from domestic workers organizations, which I think is very, very important. And now I want to give the mic to Rachel, our special guest, Rachel Lawrence. She's from Home Work Solutions, and she's going to be leading the conversation about what it means tax season for a domestic employer. Thank you, Rachel, for supporting this webinar.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be here. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. I'm using a mic, so if you can't, let me know. We're thrilled to be here. I love what Casey just said, taking the high road of employment. Sure, there are legal requirements and we can say you should do this because it's the legal thing to do. But I really like just the extra sort of emphasis she put on that there are multiple ways to go about employment, and thinking about it in that way, I just really like how she framed that. So what we're going to walk through today are definitely the basics. We're not going into unusual circumstances in this webinar. There are certainly those in all care capacities or in all domestic work capacities where, you know, there's a special situation or someone's traveling with a family or those sort of things. We aren't really going into those today. I'm happy to always field those questions by phone or email, dive into your specific situation, but we're going to touch on just sort of the general basics of what everyone should know, and we can work from there in our understanding. So first, we're going to go over those basics. Second, we're going to talk about getting on the books, maybe if you aren't already on the books, meaning paying your employee legally or you being paid legally. And then we're going to also dive into more state-specific laws that apply to New York. New York has more than some states, and so we'll sort of go from federal on to state. And we can go ahead and change the slide. Oh, we're on the last slide. All right, so before we get started, I have to give the disclaimer. This is not specific tax or legal advice for you personally. This is for general knowledge. And so if you have questions, certainly we can chat, you know, like I said, call or email. But ultimately, when it comes to the real nitty-gritty, you're going to want to get the advice of an attorney or a tax professional such as a CPA. So let's go over some of the basics here. I like to do a big slide and then work through the points. The reason being is because the second I say taxes, everybody has anxiety. As soon as I start going through numbers and requirements and laws and all of those scary words, everybody starts trying to take down as many notes as they possibly can because they're terrified they're going to miss something. So take a moment, look at the slide. We're going to work through it together. I know that word causes anxiety, but it's okay. We're going to do it together. So first of all, are you even an employer? This is one of the biggest questions that I get. So it depends. Most of the time, the answer is yes. But let's talk about what makes that a yes or a no, in case you're one of the minority that is a no. So classification of a worker is key. And the way that you classify your worker and go about determining their classification is by some parameters. I wish I could tell you if we work through this and you score 8 out of 10, you're a W-2 employee. And if you score less than that, you're a 1099, but it's just not set up that way. It's about what they call totality of circumstances. Like I said, if you can't make up your mind, the default answer is yes, you are an employer or yes, you are an employee, because that is true of most situations that we'll be working with. So as far as the classification goes, the way that you sort of figure this out are things that are called, just so you can have things to Google later, ABC tests. That has to do with who's in control of the work being done. IRS has a document called 926. It's their handbook on being a household employer. Also, there are things like FLSA that sort of help direct this. FLSA is the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so all of these things sort of play together to get us to that most of the time, yes. So let's talk about those ABC parameters. If you, and I'm going to speak from the employer's perspective in this, if you, the employer, are controlling the work being done, and this person is coming into your home and they are doing work for you on a consistent basis, pretty much the answer is yes, you're an employer and they are a W-2 employee. And you might say, well, why is that? Why can't they be an independent contractor like the person that I hired to paint my house? It's because they're not controlling what's happening. So if you're telling them things like, I need you here on these days at these times, you're boxing them into what that employment relationship looks like. If you're telling them, you know, my daughter or my mom or whoever care is being given for likes cheese sandwiches on Tuesdays and tomato soup on Thursdays, you're giving some pretty comprehensive guidelines of how that work is to be done. One that really, I think, drives the point home for a lot of people is whether or not this person that you're having to come in to do the care could sub out. Could they say, well, my best friend's a nanny, she's great, so she's going to come tomorrow and I'm not going to ask your approval, and so she's a substitute worker. In most care situations, the answer is no, of course we wouldn't want that to happen as an employer. We want to maintain control over who's in our home, how the work's being done, and the qualifications of that person. So that's when you really end up in this W-2 household employer situation. Arguably, there are occasional cases where this is not true. If you have, let's say, a tutor coming in to tutor your kids, or a house cleaner, a housekeeper that has their own business, there's an argument that that is maybe an option, that they are what's called an independent contractor and are instead given a 1099, or perhaps they're invoicing you from their business. Some sort of hallmarks of this relationship is they say, you know, listen, I do this work for 5 other families. I'm only available on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. or I'm only available for these 4 hours on Thursday, things like that. Those are, as you can see, sort of hallmarks that they're controlling the relationship, and they are giving their services or selling their services to other people other than you, so they're not financially dependent on solely you. Generally, they're going to market those services through business cards, websites, flyers, those sort of things. Those are hallmarks of somebody who is truly an independent contractor. So again, you can kind of see just through comparing the two that in most situations of nanny, senior care workers, helpers or care workers for anyone who's disabled, any sort of long-term or full service housekeeping that's happening on, you know, maybe multiple days of the week, those sort of things are always going to be W-2 employees because of the nature of the control. So just dabbling into IRS 926 a little bit, that IRS employer handbook. Let me tell you, it is a thrilling read of words you cannot understand in situations that you are certain are not yours. So definitely we have resources on our website that sort of makes that user friendly, takes all that information and boils it down to something I think is more usable. But it goes through things like, who isn't your employee? There are a couple exemptions, I guess I'll call them. You know, when your 17-year-old babysits your 10-year-old, not your employee. If your parents are going to help out with the kids, not your employee. You can see that these tend to be connected to family relationships and things like that. So if you're hiring someone that I always joke, have to interview, this person is probably your employee. And then as far as thresholds go, that's sort of the last thing that we look at. Okay, we know you're controlling the work, W-2 employee. We know these people aren't your family members. So IRS 926 says, yep, still your employee. Okay, but what about taxes? I know they're my employee, but how do I know if taxes are due and I have responsibilities there? Well, that has to do with thresholds. It has to do with how much you're paying this person. So the one that gets all the publicity is the FICA tax threshold. This is when you have to withhold Social Security and Medicare from your employees and remit it on their behalf to the government. So usually this is the one that gets the bigger headlines or more articles written about it. And for this tax year, it changes every tax year. It is $2,600. And so people get that number stuck in their head for good reasons. It's everywhere on the internet. Because it's a federal number, and so it applies to the most people. And it has to do also with when you have to change something about the way that you're paying someone, right? You have to withhold these taxes from them. But there are other tax thresholds that are lower. Most states have it around $1,000 for unemployment, and then the federal unemployment also at $1,000. So really an employer starts paying taxes on these wages at around $1,000 in most places. And then they have to start taking Social Security and Medicare taxes out of their employees' pay at $2,600. So why not just wait till we get to those numbers to think about this? Well, because in grand government tradition, when you cross that threshold, you must go all the way back to $1 and start doing it from that first dollar that changed hands. So look at your situation for a moment. Think about if you think you're going to cross these tax thresholds. If so, go ahead and go on the safe side and do it from the beginning. And then obviously sort of we'll move on to what the employer and employee taxes are next. So I haven't forgotten about other taxes being withheld from employees' pay. So let's jump into employer taxes. Hardline number, 10 to 12%, in addition to the wages that you pay your employee. And I'm going to say that point again, because it's one that a lot of us are not familiar with. Employers pay taxes in addition to the wages that they pay their employee. These are solely the employer's responsibility. They cannot be taken out of the employee's pay or any other more creative strategy for paying these taxes that I have heard over the years. So what are these taxes? Well, employers pay the other half of Social Security. They pay the other half of Medicare. And then they pay into unemployment, which I hinted at as well, both federal and state. And then sometimes there are local taxes, city taxes, county taxes. It depends on where you're located as to what those are. More and more, the common one that we're seeing is a tax to fund programs for paid family medical leave. So people in a state or in a locality say, we want this leave. Somebody says, well, how are you going to pay for it? And they say, well, we'll take out this tiny tax, much like unemployment, and then we will have that sort of accumulate in a state fund or a local fund. And when somebody needs to use that, when an employee says, I need paid time off, we'll draft from that fund. So if you see sort of these mysterious taxes and you don't know what they are, if they have letters like PFL, for paid family leave or paid family medical leave, that's what they are. And these, it depends on where you are. Sometimes they're paid by the employer, sometimes paid by the employee. I'm seeing some talk about people splitting, things like that, because this is a very dynamic area right now. Then as far as employee taxes, we're generally more familiar with those because most of us at some point, if not currently, are employees. So we're sort of aware of what's being withheld from our pay. So there's an employee half of Social Security, there's an employee half of Medicare, and then federal and state income taxes, unless you're in a state that doesn't have state income taxes. And again, it looks like the very bottom of the slide's cut off, but it says local taxes. So that could be a city, a county. Again, this is just a mechanism of how different things in our communities are funded. I know I live in Oregon and we have a transit tax because we've decided that transit is really important to us, public transit. And so employers pay into this fund that helps fund the public transit system. So again, you can always Google little things you see in your pay stub for the funny little acronyms that people use for these taxes. You know, state income taxes SIT, federal income taxes LIT, things like that. And then let's talk a little bit about records, because this feels like a lot of numbers and a lot of taxes and a lot of things we're not familiar with seeing every day, because a lot of this isn't taught in sort of our day-to-day life. So when in doubt, write it down is always what I tell people. We live in a digital age now where dropping someone an email is a great way. Back when I started my nanny career, more than a few years ago, we used notebooks, right? There was a notebook on the counter. I clocked in, I wrote my time down, I wrote whatever I did with the kids down. You know, I clocked out, or I wrote a note to the parents. Writing it down is just not only good for legal and tax record keeping, it's also just a really good communication tool. So whether you communicate through an app or email or a notebook or whatever that is, write it down. It keeps everyone on the same page. So other sort of tools for writing it down, work agreements. You know, I really can't say enough for a work agreement. People have this thought that it is an agreement that fences everyone in, where someone wins and someone loses, or everybody compromises. I think of it as a communication document. Again, the more we're all sort of playing on the same board, then we all understand things. There's fewer misunderstandings. You know, gosh, was the 4th of July a paid holiday or an unpaid holiday? I don't remember, because I started in August. That was a whole year ago. I don't remember looking at my agreement or talking about that with my employer. Also in New York, you're supposed to have one legally. So you want to make sure and have details, not that are just the bare minimum, but that will actually help the relationship, because in my perspective, that's their point. You also need to have things like pay stubs. Why? It really goes back to the days of usually big employers, industrial employers, having little bits they were taking out of their employees' pay, and maybe the employee knew about it, maybe they didn't, maybe a uniform was extraordinarily expensive, things like that. It's, again, just to keep communication channels open. And these days, again, with these sometimes new taxes that are coming up with paid family medical leave and things like that, it keeps everyone on the same page, like, oh yeah, I can see my employers are doing that. Or in the household space, employers are actually not legally required to withhold your federal and state and local income taxes. They can say, I'm going to let you do that on your own. We'll withhold Social Security and Medicare and any other required taxes like a local tax, but you can go do your income taxes on your own. And so a pay stub is a really good way to know that, right? It's not fun to get to the end of the year and say, oh gosh, I just realized my employer was never withholding taxes from my pay, and now I have thousands of dollars in a tax bill due. You know, those pay stubs are a communication tool. Look over them, make sure they look how you think they should look, and have baseline information on them that feels useful to you. And then year-end documents are sort of the last on our list. What are those? A W-2 is an employee's year-end document. As far as a household employer, you will add something to your taxes called a Schedule H. And a Schedule H essentially is 2 sheets of paper that say, I was a household employer. This is how much money changed hands in the way of wages. And its job really is to calculate a bill of payroll taxes that are owed. But these payroll taxes that you're paying in and the ones you're holding back from your employee, you're paying in throughout the year. In most places, you're paying them in quarterly. In New York, it's not so clear cut. It has to do with how much you have in your hand at any one time as to when the state wants it. So basically, you're paying them in throughout the year. And there's another little box on your taxes where you take credit for payments that you've made throughout the year. And when this is done correctly, the amount you owe and the amount that you've paid in balance out. So really, it's more like record keeping is how I think of it. You're saying to the government, look, here's the proof that I did everything I was supposed to. All right, Sarah, you can click the slide for me. So if you've been doing all of this, great, good for you. You are in the, what they estimate is the top 12 to 15% of employers in this country that work in the household space. So good job. If no one's telling you that, let me tell you that. Good job. I talk to people every day that this is confusing and hard, and they do not have the time for this, and they do not have the money for this, and they do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. And I applaud you. If you are not doing it, but this conversation is maybe making you think about changing your mind and doing things differently, good. That's all I ask. Please think about doing this. It's the right thing to do. It's the legal thing to do. And there are ways to get on the books, even without waiting till your next hire. So one, what does this look like if you're doing it from the beginning before you jump in and say you're going to do it? Things like tax accounts need to be set up. So you usually start with federal, then you go to the state and you say, hey, I have this really cool federal number. Can I have a state number? Some states have one number and some have two. So find out what you need in your state. And this is essentially just a path. This is how you identify yourself as exactly who you are, right? If my name is Sarah Jones, I bet there's more than one of me in the country. So the government needs a way to track you, much like they use a social security number, so that they know that it's you, Sarah Jones, not this Sarah Jones. So I like to think of them as almost like a bridge or passageway, these tax numbers, so that you can get the information and the funds that need to get to the government to them, and they know exactly who you are. As far as hiring documents, you need to have, depending where you are, certain hire documents in place. As mentioned, in New York, you need a work agreement. You can, I won't spend time going through all the details of what you need. It looked like maybe you all had already done that or were going to do that as part of this course, so that's great. But you need some baseline information about what you're agreeing to. The next is new hire reporting. What is new hire reporting? It's basically raising your hand and declaring this relationship is about to start or is starting. What do states use this for? They use it mostly for garnishment of wages. And what do I mean by that? If you are paying out child support or support to your former spouse, or you had, some tax liability in the past that maybe you're paying off in installments. It's just keeping everyone informed of where you're working, how much you're making, if there's a garnishment. So usually what happens is if there is a garnishment, a lot of people are scared of this word. The government entity lets your employer know, and if you're the employer, you'll get a notice that says, hi, your employee is, has this order. You need to withhold this much from their pay and get it here. So that's what new hire reporting is mainly used for. A lot of our industry, because of the nature of the history of the work that we do, a lot of it is gender-based. So there are more women statistically in this profession than there are men. And actually garnishments, there are more men. So it's actually strangely that we don't have those as much in this industry as, say, an office job. So they are a little less common. And obviously this is a national statistic, right? Your neighborhood might be different. Your household may be different. I know personally, my last nanny was not female. So, it's a very generalized scenario, but it does tend to come into play less in this space than other spaces. What if your worker that you love and care for and want to hire or have a relationship with is undocumented, and so they don't have the documentation that they need to prove that they are able to work in this country legally? Well, paying them on the books will not make it legal to have them as your employee, but it will solve the tax piece. So there are some reasons you'd want to do this. One is the employer. If you're hiring someone who doesn't have legal working status, you sort of have two issues at hand. One is whether or not they're able to take a job legally, and the other is the tax piece. So if your employee will get or already has what's called an I-10 number, it's an individual taxpayer ID number. It looks like a social, starts with a 9. And what it does is it allows them to pay taxes into the system and you to pay your taxes into the system for their payroll taxes. And that way, a couple of things can happen. One, as the household employer, you've at least eliminated the tax piece, right? And then as the employee, perhaps the employee's working towards legal working status, and they are at some various stage in the court system of getting this. And so what it allows them to do is to pay in their taxes now, which says, one, look at me, I am doing the right thing. Yes, please give me legal working status because I will do this, the right way. The other is that they can go back and file corrections on their tax returns, what are called amendments. And once they have their legal working status and a social security number, and essentially claim those dollars back so that they can have social security and things like that down the road. Also, there are some countries that if the person ever returns to their country of origin, say, when they're older and want to retire, there are some avenues to sort of request those dollars from the Social Security Administration to be transferred to the equivalent of the Social Security Administration in their country. So there are still some benefits here as part of the rules and laws. The tax organizations do not talk to the immigration. So there is not a need to feel fear in this, that this is some, list for someone to come after you and harass you. Then what do you do if you haven't done this in the past? You're seeing this webinar and you think, oh, I wish I'd known that. I didn't know, and I really want to go back and fix this. Well, you can do that. So what do you do about what are called prior quarters? Because most of this is assessed in tax quarters. So for example, we're about to end the first tax quarter, let's see, tomorrow. So January, February, March is the first tax quarter. So you'll sort of figure out, when did this employment take place? How far back do I need to go fix it? And you can go back, like I said, just quarters, if maybe you just hired this person 6 months ago, or you can go back years if you want to, and sort of clean this up. It's sort of complicated in the way that you need a professional to help you. You need a CPA, possibly a payroll company, those people to go back who just know what they're doing, right? They know how to clean this up effectively and get all the monies where they need to go, to come back and talk to you if penalties and interest are assessed, those sort of things. And so they can also, if you're using CPA, do these amendments for you. One thing I like to remind people is, if you're going to go back and do this, there are sort of two parties at play here. And you want to make sure that your former employee knows that you are doing this, because they need to go back and amend their tax return also. You will end up paying a little bit more going back and fixing this problem than you would have had you done it the correct way the first time. But to my last point there, when we know better, we have the opportunity to do better. And so we have to know better first. If you had no idea, and I tell you, every time I do one of these webinars, there's someone sitting in this audience having like a heart attack, because they would have done all of these things if they had only known. But it's not like this is on, your high school algebra test. It's not something that most people are familiar with. And unless you have a friend that tells you, if someone you're interviewing to hire tells you, you're using an agency that tells you, like a staffing agency, a nanny agency, who's to know? Thankfully, there's a lot of information out there now that we have things like Google. Do please get your information from a reliable source, a big national payroll company like ours, directly from the state, directly from the feds. No one should ask you to pay them for information. Services, yes. Information, no. So just be careful of where you're reading and how you're getting your information. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So, questions and discussion. I know that these are sensitive topics, and sometimes people really have a burning question, but they really don't want to ask it in this forum. That's okay. And again, I acknowledge we all make mistakes, right? If this is where you've made one, it's okay, it's a mistake. It can be solved. You can drop things into the chat if that feels comfortable. If you want to have a private conversation, my contact information is up there in the left-hand corner. You know, myself or one of my colleagues is happy to discuss these things with you. We also have a tremendous number of resources. And actually, I just realized we skipped a slide. We skipped over New York. We'll jump back really quick because these may be some of your questions. So what are some baseline New York things for consideration? Minimum wage. We are on what we call the march to the $15 minimum wage. So we are seeing most states sort of incrementally increase their minimum wage 6 months or a year at a time till we get to what's a more livable wage of 15. Will the feds jump on that boat? Yet to be seen, but maybe that federal minimum wage is going to work itself up a little bit too. But here are your wages for New York State and New York City. Overtime. Yes, it's a thing. No, there's not a way to work around it. It doesn't matter what you agree to in a work agreement. An employer and an employee can't say, well, I agreed to work 80 hours with no overtime. You cannot sign away your legal rights. I jokingly tell people, because it makes the point without making anyone feel bad, if we could just say whatever we want, we'll sign a contract, then hitman would be legal, right? You could just say, well, we all agreed it was fine if they went over and killed that person. And I use that example because it's so outrageous, right? And it's so far from what we're talking about, but you can't sign these rights away. These are guaranteed. Anything for a live out person in New York, meaning they do not reside in your residence on property, is 40 hours. Time and a half is what they call the overtime differential, meaning they get paid 1.5 times their regular rate of pay. If you have a live-in, 44 hours. Different states have different rules, so this isn't blanket applicable. The 40 is federal, so I'd say that's the closest to blanket applicable that we have. But other states like California have things like daily overtime. What are some things for consideration in the insurance space? Excuse me. Anyone in New York that has an employee for 20 or more hours a week, and this is a fairly new law, it's only about a year old, needs SDI, which is state disability insurance, and PFL, which is paid family leave insurance. And you can get this from the New York State Insurance Fund. If you have someone working full-time, you must also have workers' comp. Workers' comp is the insurance that comes into play if an employee gets hurt on the job. It covers their medical bills, it covers their lost wages. In New York, you're required by law to have it. This is really where New York gets serious. This is where they lay down the hammer. I believe last time I checked, it was $2,000 for every 10 days you didn't have it was the fine they could levy against you. Again, if you are the person in this audience having a minor heart attack right now about the things that you didn't do and would have done, a good tip, if you are putting everything on the books, proactively write the New York State Workers' Comp Board a letter and say, oh my gosh, I would have done this if I had realized it. I am so sorry. I have it now. I will always maintain it going forward. And those letters go a long way. We see them usually, of course, this is again a blanket statement, usually back that down to a couple of $100 and a very firm warning to never do it again. So what else is required? It depends on where you are in the state. So if you are just in New York State, but not the city, you need to be giving your employees 3 days of paid time off. And if you're in the city, it's 5 because the city adds an extra 2 days to the state law. Most people have these accrue rather than giving them up front. So I believe it's 1 hour for every 30 hours worked is the sort of typical accrual. And then things like pay rate documents, we sort of touched on this before. You need to be very clear to your employee what you're removing from their pay, how many hours they worked, what rate they're being paid at, when an overtime differential goes into play, and then some baseline information about like who they are and who you are. So those are important documents. Work agreements. Again, we've sort of touched on this. We have a sample on our website if anyone wants to look at it. But it goes over some baseline things, right? You want to know what everybody's agreeing to. what's cause for termination, what happens when you all want to part ways, whether on good terms or bad terms. Again, I think of these as communication documents. And then as far as I've transposed these, the pay stubs is sort of what I referred to before, and the pay rate notice is sort of at the time you're hired. So again, more information on our website, the URL, if you're in a different state, if you look at the last part of that URL, it says new-York. If you are in a double name state like North Carolina, same format. If you are in a state with just one name, such as California, you can swap those out there and they will pull up the information on your state. And now we can take questions. Did we have any in the chat?
Thank you, Rachel. I don't think we have any questions in the chat, but we have some questions that were sent in advance.
Oh, great.
And yeah, and again, it is going to be recorded. So yeah, we are going to be sharing the recording later. So I'm just going to share a couple, and also want the panel to maybe share some comments. Also, the panel is composed of people who are part of the sector, so definitely have the experience of know whether as a worker or an employer to deal with what it means, the tax and filing taxes as in this sector. But one of the questions that I have, which seems kind of, you already kind of talk about that, but let's say someone who informally pay a neighbor to spend the night with my elderly mother when a family member can't. Am I responsible for paying taxes?
Sure. So let's go back to some of those parameters that we hit on and apply them to this specific example, right? If we are truly talking about occasional, once, twice a year, we're probably not crossing those tax thresholds. So should the I will use this term employee, should the person receiving the income declare it on their taxes as miscellaneous income? Yes, that is what the IRS would like to see. Does the person who asked the question, the employer of sorts, they're probably not going to cross these tax thresholds and therefore require sort of all of this setup and reporting and filing. You know, I think it's good to think about these things in advance, right? If this isn't going to be once or twice a year, you don't want to, when it gets to be the third or fourth time, have to go back and sort of think this all through and go, oh, okay, we didn't do that from the beginning and now we have a little work to do. So as much as you can, think about it ahead of time. Also, a key point in this is whoever's dollars are funding the wages is the employer. So in a senior care situation, sometimes it is not always clear to the people involved who the employer is, because care is for mom, but daughter's paying it. So who's the employer? Well, in a tax scenario, the daughter's the employer. In a wage and hour dispute, they might be co-employers. It depends on how much control the mom is exerting on her own care. You know, this is where I say when you get into sort of this detail level of, gosh, who's the employer of record here? Are we co-employers? This is really territory. When you're getting into enough of the nitty gritty, you should consult both your tax pro and your attorney.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel. I have another one, and then I'll go with the comments on maybe questions from the panel. Another employer. I have a house cleaner come to clean my home twice a week for $100. Do I need to pay taxes on that?
Okay, so we can see probably tax thresholds are going to be crossed if this person is coming consistently, right? You know, 10 weeks we've crossed the first one. You can see that 26 weeks we've crossed all of them. So, you know, likely you have responsibilities on this. I will go back to citing sort of the control, and if this person is your employee, if you are the only person they work for and they don't really do this work for anyone else and you're exerting a lot of control over the relationship, again, I'm not an attorney, but I would say, you know, if you were my best girlfriend asking my opinion, I would say, gosh, if you're controlling a lot of this, I think she really is your employee. Alternatively, if this is Sandy's maid service and she does this for 6 other families and she has business cards and a website and she told you she could only do Tuesday and Thursday, and then there's an argument that maybe she's an independent contractor. I would urge you to look over an ABC test. And you can just Google that. You can put ABC test employment and you'll see multiple websites that come up. Again, try to go with one that looks reputable, right? A .org, a .gov sort of scenario. And then just look at it. Look at the totality of the circumstances and see what you think. What I always tell people is read the information, sit with it for a second, and then decide whether you could argue your point with straight face in court, right? If you think it's really arguable, then, and you want a final opinion, go to an attorney. But I think it's pretty clear usually when you read the points in an ABC test, you really get a strong feeling one way or the other.
Thank you, Rachel. And this is really great, amazing information. And I'm really happy to have this conversation in this space. And I want to invite Marisa to maybe make a comment, or also to give us the perspective from the domestic worker sector, right? I mean, which is very diverse, it's not homogeneous. And sometimes taxing, it's really so strict, right? That doesn't necessarily understand the diversity of the domestic work sector. Marisa.
Hey everybody. It's so nice to be here tonight. My name is Marisa Centeno. I am the New York Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And our New York chapter has over 20,000 contacts across and participants of domestic workers across New York State. And taxes is one of those topics that it it's encompasses so much of what it means to be an employee, that workers themselves, because the profession has been purposefully like deprofessionalized historically, that in the movement to ensure that domestic workers have standards and rights, it comes to play that there's so much to learn about the process of being an employer and an employee. Domestic workers are majority women of color. In New York, they are a majority of immigrant women of color, and so that means that as domestic employees, there's a very uh, wide swath of understanding that people come to work about, like taxes, about pay stubs, about their own rights. You may have an immigrant worker who doesn't know really how the tax system works in the United States. And it's really important for employers not to presume someone's immigration status or documentation status, especially in New York, since there are rights that do protect those identities, in particular in New York City, and being able to have open and honest conversations, but ones that are professional conversation, ones that really honors the fact that this is an employee and that they're here to work in your home. Throughout the pandemic, uh, it came to be that people really understood what it meant to work from home. Domestic workers working from your home all day every day has been doing so the whole time, and so your home is a workplace. um and as such, these are good conversations to have in the employer and employee scenario. And I just wanted to add that for workers, right, if you're an employer and you're also learning about this process and trying to kind of get everything in order, there are resources too for workers to better understand, right? Like you might go to your tax agent or a professional. There are resources for workers to have access to that information as well. And so what I would say is, if you're having this conversation and the both of you need more information, you can say to your employee, hey, there's this organization called the National Domestic Workers Alliance. They have resources and connections to tax and financial professionals that can offer you free low cost consulting, and we can refer workers over to locally here in New York. We refer over to Urban Upbound, who help our workers understand their tax status, their scenario, understanding what is an ITIN, what does it mean to file taxes, and even supports them in filing those taxes when the time comes, because it is a part of not only just working, but it's also a part of having a fuller access to one's rights. When the pandemic happened and domestic workers were unemployed in mass, um, many of them could have filed for unemployment insurance and weren't able to because they were not being paid on the books. And when both employers and workers kind of presume that they don't have the ability to do that, or in many ways feel like it's being like they get to be paid more if they were paid off the books, and then realizing later when it's way too late that they could have had many weeks worth of unemployment insurance, as par for the course, or for domestic workers, a majority, women, mothers, and are, when they themselves need to take family paid leave, they can have access to that. And so few domestic workers get to um, have that privilege just because they haven't been paid on the books, right? And so these are things that can be planned for. These are conversations that can happen, and it doesn't mean that, let's say a domestic worker becomes pregnant, oh, that means she's gotta either quit or you're gonna fire her. If you fire her, you're in a whole other boat of hot water. But she doesn't necessarily have to quit either, right? You want to keep a good employee, and there's a ways to do that. And so I would say, just tonight, thank you so much, Rachel, for having shared with us like the basics, and I found it really informative. And I hope that for employers, they find it equally as informative, but it's also something where you presented information that was easily to digest, and that they can also have these conversations with the people that work for them. And then for workers, for domestic workers, have those conversations with your employer, and then come back to us if you have more questions or you want to learn more, and we can refer you as well.
Marisa, I couldn't agree with you more. And it made me realize that actually I don't think I spoke enough from the worker's perspective. And so, yes, I mean, seek those resources. You all do such amazing work. I truly, every time I see you all out and about and your social media posts, it's amazing. And yeah, we have resources from a worker's perspective too, and English and Spanish. So please, what Marisa is saying is so true. Please seek this information. And I find a lot of the time people seek it sheepishly. They feel bad for not knowing this in advance. Let me tell you, I talk to some of the most rich and powerful people in this country on a daily basis, and they don't know it either. It's not about these things that we assume, like, oh, I didn't go to the Ivy League school, I didn't do these things. it's because we have the most complicated tax system in the world and we don't teach it to anyone. So just know that there should be no shame and guilt in not knowing this. Go find the resources. It was 40 something years that FLSA existed before a domestic worker was included in it. I mean, it's not our fault. People don't know about it on a grand scale, which is why we're having these webinars, right? So yeah, there are workplace rights, and know that your rights are your rights, whether you're paid legally or not, right? You can go file for unemployment and you're going to get it if you can prove you worked for them. It's a hard moment for a worker to be put in a position of sort of throwing this family that you worked for under the bus, but you have to feed your kids sometimes. And so those rights are yours for a reason, and they're yours to claim.
Mhm.
Thank you, Rachel. This is such a rich conversation, and always has to end, and that definitely we'll have a second part for this later in the year. But I want to give the opportunity to one more comment or two more comments before we end the discussion. I don't know whether it's Casey or Alisa who want to share something.
I can share. I'm Elisa. I'm an affiliate of Hand in Hand, so I obviously encourage all employers to join and become a member, because there's just an exorbitant amount of information there that helps you be a high road employer. And I think it's important that agencies like myself, I speak on behalf of the agencies that I am affiliated with. We really educate the clients working with us to employ a nanny in their home, or housekeepers. We do that also, but just helping them understand the fairest and most ethical way to employ a domestic worker. And I think Marissa, Rachel, Casey, everyone really touched on all the points of why this is important. Tatiana, when you first opened up, I mean, it stems from everything from the history of this work to our own homes, where we're seeing elderly care and just so many people compromised by just the lack of support for the care infrastructure here in this country. But thanks to a lot of these affiliates we have in the room here, doing the good work and trying to get these messages out, I'm just I'm really grateful that everyone's here. Rachel is somebody I refer all of my clients to, so that they're able to have kind of a double, if they need to just get information and do it themselves because they might have a family office, it's great to have that access to Hand in Hand. It's readily available. And also like having Rachel to work with all of my very high profile and, wealthier clients that have a lot more questions, because there could be other, repercussions if they're not doing things fairly and legally, like, exposure in the media, which I think, is really important. And I try to advise all of my clients on not only that, but also the impact it's having on those individuals that are caring for, our most prized possessions in our homes, which are, our peaceful sanctuaries. So I just think all of that transference of energy is so important to keep in mind, especially given the times we're all living in. So thank you all for, doing this. And I really appreciate Rachel taking the time out to, educate us all, because it was a lot of really valuable information.
Thank you.
I'll just add my appreciation and say I'm already thinking of all of the networks I have that I want to share this invaluable information with. So thank you so much. It's a gift. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for staying after 9 p.m. And special thanks to you, Rachel. This is so important. And I think we all bring up one part, right, of what needs to be done in this sector to do the right thing, no? And I think employers understand that. Employers who reach out to us, reach out to you, want to do the right thing, and we want to make sure that we actually also can provide all this information, no, and create different spaces and different tools in which they can access such a valuable and helpful information. So thanks again, and I want to invite whoever is watching to join us. The next webinar is going to be on April 20th. It's going to be about paid safe and sick leave and how to incorporate these the legal requirements, but also what are the industry standards. No, in a work agreement, we probably have like a similar panel for that Thursday, April 20th. 8 p.m. And again, join us. Join if you're an employer, join hand in hand. If you're an employer who needs support on filing taxes or any other support, reach out to Homework Solutions. If you're a worker, reach out to NDWA, the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And thanks again for joining us tonight. We'll see you at our next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you. It was an honor.
Good night.
Good night.